Well, hello and welcome to the Village Online. I'm Travis. I'm one of the pastors here. We're living in what many sociologists call the age of distraction. The age of distraction. I remember several years ago, I was with a friend and we were at a bagel place, getting some coffee and bagels and getting breakfast. And suddenly, I had an alert in my pocket, and so I got my phone out just to check on what the alert was. The next thing I knew, I slowly looked up from the screen, remembering where I was, and my friend was just sitting across from me, just looking at me and smiling. And I said, "How long was I in there?" And he said, 10 minutes. 10 minutes. I got one alert on my phone. I looked at it, and of course this happened to all of us. One alert led to another alert, led to another alert, and before I knew it, I'd spent 10 minutes staring at my phone and completely forgetting where I was, completely forgetting that I was having coffee with a friend. We're doing this series that we kicked off last week called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. It's based on a book by John Mark Comer. I've got a copy of it here. I can't recommend this book to you highly enough. It is one of the most probably influential and important books that I've read in a long time. So you can pick this up. I'd encourage you to do that. We're going to be tracking with some of the things that Comer writes in this book. And in his book, he traces the history of time and distraction in a chapter that he calls The Brief History of Speed. I'll kind of hit some of the highlights of that. The sundial, as far back as 200 BC, people were complaining about this new technology that we now know as the sundial. The Roman playwright Plautus wrote this. He said, "The gods confound the man who first found out how to distinguish hours. Confound him too, who in this place set up a sundial to cut and hack my days so wretchedly into small portions." In the 6th century, St. Benedict organized monks in a monastery around 7 different times to pray. And by the 12th century, in order to call the monks to prayer at the proper times, monks had invented the mechanical clock. But what really began to change was in the year 1370, when the first public clock tower was built in Cologne, Germany. And so before that moment, when the first public clock tower was erected, time was natural. You got up with the sun. You went to bed with the sun. Days in the summer, when days were longer and busier, and you stayed up later. And during the winter, when the days were shorter, you worked shorter amount of time and you went to bed earlier. In 1879, I talked about this last week, in 1879, Edison perfected the light bulb, which made it more possible and reasonable to stay up after dark. And before Edison perfected the light bulb and the light bulb became commonplace in homes across America, the average American slept 11 hours a night. I think the average today is something like 7 hours. And I don't know about you, but for me, it feels like a good night when I've gotten at least 7 hours. In the 1960s, futurists all over the world predicted that by now we'd all be working less hours, because so much of our work would be automated. There was a group of futurists who went in and testified before a Senate subcommittee in 1967, and they said their prediction was that by 1985, the average American would only be working 22 hours per week for 27 weeks per year. That was the prediction in 1967. And what's actually happened now is the opposite. The average American is working 4 weeks more per year than they were even in 1979. And then in 2007, the world changed forever. My oldest son was born, so I'm sure he thinks I'm talking about him, but there are some other things that happened in and around 2007. The world changed forever within just a few months of each other. In and around 2007, Steve Jobs and Apple introduced the iPhone. Facebook became available to everybody who had a valid email address. Twitter became its own platform. The App Store launched and became a reality, and the cloud was introduced to the world. There's been more technological change in the last 20 years than maybe in all of human history before that. When I graduated from college and started my first real job, which was 20 years ago this month, actually, 20 years ago this month, I had a desktop computer in my office, which was the only place that I could access my email and my computer files and just about anything related to work. So when I left the office at night, I essentially had to leave work in the office. I remember I advocated so hard to be able to get a laptop computer, and I regret it to this day, so that I could take my work home. I really wanted to be able to take my work home with me. I had no idea what kind of Pandora's box I would be opening with that. Just 15 years ago, it's not that long, just 15 years ago, a smartphone wasn't a thing. Wi-Fi access everywhere wasn't a thing. But if you go back to the video that we watched just a minute ago where people were asked about their cell phone usage, here's the number. A recent study found that the average iPhone user touches their phone 2,617 times a day. That's touches, clicks, swipes, taps, over 2,600 times every single day. Now, here's something interesting about that. Interestingly, there are studies that are showing that our increased access to information is actually decreasing our collective IQ. Our attention spans have shortened. In the year 2000, a study was done that found the average attention span for an American was 12 seconds, which, wasn't that great to begin with. A recent study found that the average attention span for an American is around 8 seconds. To put that in perspective, they say that a goldfish has the attention span of 9 seconds. We're losing to goldfish. Right? I'm getting this reputation in my family at home for being anti-technology. I hear things like, Dad's anti-technology, right? And my response is that I'm not anti-technology. I don't really want to go back to an agrarian society. I don't want to have to do subsistence farming. I'm not anti-technology, but I am anti what technology seems to be doing to us. Sean Parker was the first president of Facebook. He's no longer with Facebook. In fact, he now calls himself a conscientious objector to the reality of social media. Listen to what he said in a recent interview. He said, God only knows what it's doing to our children's brains. The thought process that went into building these applications, Facebook being the first of them, was all about how do we consume as much of your time and conscious attention as possible. And that means that we need to sort of give you a little dopamine hit every once in a while because someone liked or commented on a photo or a post or whatever, and that's going to get you to contribute more content, and that's going to get you more likes and comments. It's a social validation feedback loop. Check this out. He said, exactly the kind of thing that a hacker like myself would come up with because you're exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology. John Mark Comer writes this in his book. He says, the odds are not in our favor. There are literally thousands of apps and devices intentionally engineered to steal your attention, and with it, your money. Reminder, he says, your phone doesn't actually work for you. You pay for it, yes, but your phone works for a multi-billion-dollar corporation in California, not for you. He goes on to say this, you're the customer, or you're not the customer, you're the product. It's your attention that's for sale, along with your peace of mind. One researcher said that continuous partial attention is the new normal for our society. Many psychologists and social scientists are now arguing that the vast majority of Americans' relationships to their phones can at least be classified as a compulsion, which just means that we're compelled, we have to check the last text that we got, or we have to check one more email, or we have to look at Instagram one more time, or we've got to go back and read the breaking news just 20 minutes after we read the last breaking news. One author wrote this in the New York Times. He said, addiction is the relentless pull to a substance or an activity that becomes so compulsive, it ultimately interferes with everyday life. By that definition, nearly everyone I know is addicted in some measure to the internet. Right? If I asked you to raise your hand right now to say, hey, who of you thinks that you're addicted to the internet or addicted to your phone? Most of you probably wouldn't raise your hand. You probably would say, I'm not addicted. I don't have a problem. So I'll ask you this. You'd probably think you're the exception. I'll ask you this. What would you feel like? What would happen? What would happen if I asked you to put your phone away, to turn it off and put it away somewhere out of reach for the next 24 hours, just 24 hours straight? How would you feel in that moment? Now, why does this matter? Who cares, right? Maybe that's true, but who cares? here's why it matters. It matters because for centuries, people across all different disciplines of thought, psychology, neurobiology, theology, have come to this conclusion when it comes to your attention and my attention. They've said this: you become what you give your attention to. Somebody once said, attention is the portal to your formation as a human being. William James is known as the father of American psychology, and he once said this: we must reflect that when we reach the end of our days, our life experience will equal what we have paid attention to, whether by choice or by default. In other words, what you give your attention to is what you become. What you fill your mind with, it will shape the trajectory of your character. And in the end, our life is little more than the sum of what we gave our attention to. Right? So, for instance, if you give all of your attention to a 24-hour news cycle where everything is breaking news and everything is a crisis and everything is a drama, and the agenda of the people at the heart of the news agency, their agenda is to make people angry and argumentative and get you to click on things and rile up a certain base of people, if that's what you give your attention to, then you will become a pawn to that agenda. If you give all of your attention to the Kardashians or to the latest season of The Bachelor, then you will become materialistic and shallow. You become what you give your attention to. If you give your attention to what everybody else is posting, then you will inevitably become anxious and dissatisfied with life because you'll always be missing out on something, or you'll constantly find yourself comparing yourself, the reality of your life. You'll constantly find yourself comparing yourself on your worst days with these perfectly posed and filtered and curated and fake pictures of everybody else. You become what you give your attention to. So what's this have to do with Jesus? What's this have to do with our spiritual lives? Well, the same truth applies to our spiritual lives. Right? We said last week that when it comes to being a follower of Jesus, there are three things at the heart of that: be, become, and do. Three elements. The goal of every follower of Jesus is to be an apprentice of Jesus, to be with Jesus, to become like Jesus, and to do what Jesus would do if Jesus were living your life. Be, become, do. So the question is there anything that Jesus did? Is there anything in these pages that we can learn from Jesus that might help us deal with the chaos of our modern life? If you flip to the Gospel of Mark chapter 1, Mark 1 is essentially chronicling the first day of Jesus on the job as the Messiah. And so if you flip to Mark chapter 1, you see a lot of things. You see that Jesus starts the day by walking beside the Sea of Galilee and calling the disciples to follow him. Then he goes to the synagogue in Capernaum where he teaches and he preaches. While he's preaching, in the middle of his sermon, he's interrupted loudly by a man who's possessed by a demon. That sounds like an interesting sermon. He heals the man. He casts the demon out. Immediately following teaching in the synagogue, Jesus and the new disciples, they go to Peter's house in Capernaum. And Peter's mother-in-law is sick. And so Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law. And then it says that word spread about Jesus. And so that after sunset, the whole town ended up coming to the house. And Jesus taught and he preached and he healed, and he cast out demons late into the night. That was how he spent it was a full day. It was a full day. That's how he spent his first full day on the job as the Messiah. And then the very next thing you read in Mark's gospel is this. Mark 1:35. It says, very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went to a solitary place where he prayed. He got up, he left the house, and he went off to a solitary place where he prayed. As you read through the Gospels, you see that Jesus spent an enormous amount of time in a solitary place praying. He went to a quiet place, he went by himself, and he talked to God, he poured his heart out to God, and then he also listened for the voice of God. The story goes on. Jesus is there in the quiet place, he's praying, he's talking to God, he's listening to God, and verse 36 says, Simon and his companions went to look for Jesus. They woke up, he wasn't there, they went to look for him, and when they found him, they exclaimed this to him, Jesus, everyone is looking for you. Everyone is looking for you. You ever felt like that before? Everyone is looking for you. If you're a parent, you probably feel like that every day. There's this other story in Mark chapter 6 where it says this about Jesus. It says, so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat. You ever had a day like that? You can relate to that? All right, so when Peter said, Jesus, everyone is looking for you, this is what Jesus said back. He said, let us go somewhere else to the nearby villages so I can preach there also. That is why I have come. In other words, that's Jesus' language for no, I hear you. Everyone's looking for me. Everyone has expectations. What you read in the Gospels, what you find in the Gospels, is that Jesus didn't always do what everybody expected of him. He didn't always do what everybody expected him to do. He spent time listening for the voice of God, and if it didn't seem like God was telling him to do something, that he absolutely must do something, he didn't necessarily do it. In Mark 6, when the crowd was so hectic and the demands were so great, Jesus actually said this to his disciples. He said, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. That was the approach of Jesus over and over and over again. If you flip over to Luke's gospel, Luke chapter 5, verses 15 and 16, here's what it says. It says, yet the news spread about him all the more so that crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed, right? If you flip through Luke's gospel, you see this pattern repeated over and over and over again, that the busier Jesus became and the more demands that were placed on his time and his attention, the more time he spent away by himself in a quiet place. Be honest. Be honest. Usually for you and for me, it's the exact opposite of that, right? Usually it's the exact opposite of that. Become, do. Be with Jesus, become like Jesus. Do what Jesus would do if Jesus were living your life. Right? If Jesus were us, he would spend more time alone praying when things got busier, not less time. John Mark Comer writes this. He says, stop for a minute. Think about this. Jesus needed time in the quiet place. I repeat, Jesus needed time, and a fair bit of it. You think you don't? William Barclay was a Scottish New Testament professor in the 20th century, and he once said this, it may well be that the whole trouble in our lives is that we give God no opportunity to speak to us because we do not know how to be still and to listen. We give God no time to recharge us with spiritual energy and strength because there is no time when we wait upon him. How can we shoulder the burdens if we have no contact with him who is the Lord of all good life? I love the story of Moses in Exodus chapter 3. It's a familiar story, famous story, Moses and the burning bush. If you turn to Exodus chapter 3 in your Bible, here's what it says. It says, now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law. So Moses is a shepherd with his father-in-law's sheep. Jethro was the priest of Midian. Moses led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Now, in this time, in this day and age, it wasn't uncommon in the wilderness of Judea during the time of Moses, even to this day, because of how hot and dry and arid the climate is, it wasn't uncommon for a bush to spontaneously catch fire in the heat of the wilderness. But there was something uncommon about this bush. It's that it was on fire, but not only was it on fire, but as it was burning, the bush didn't burn up. So the question is, how long did Moses have to look at the bush before he realized that the bush wasn't burning up? Have you ever watched a fire? One of my favorite things to do in the spring and summer and fall is just sit and watch a campfire. We love to do that. We got a fire pit, or we love to go camping, and there's just something about it. You can just sit and watch a fire. I love to do that. Have you ever just sat and watched a fire to see how long it takes the log to burn up? How long was Moses there? Now, some translations, this translation, Moses says, I will go over I will go over and see this strange sight. Some translations say, I will turn aside and see this strange sight. That this bush that's on fire, it's not burning up. That means Moses had to stand there for a long time looking at this. Rabbi Kushner, who has written several great things, he wrote this about the burning bush. Listen to this. He says, the burning bush was not a miracle, it was a test. God wanted to find out whether or not Moses could pay attention to something for more than a few minutes. And when Moses did, God spoke. And then he says this, the trick is to pay attention to what is going on around you long enough to behold the miracle without falling asleep. There is another world right here within this one. Whenever we pay attention, I wonder how many burning bushes are burning all around us. And we simply don't see them because we're not paying attention, because we're distracted. John Ortberg writes this about this encounter with Moses. He says, everything turned on Moses being willing to turn aside, to interrupt his daily routine, to pay attention to the presence of God. He didn't have to. He could have looked the other way, as many of us would. He would have just missed the Exodus, the people of Israel, his calling, the reason for his existence. He would have missed knowing God. Moses had seen the shrub before, perhaps 100 times, only this time it was different, but he didn't miss it. He stopped. He turned aside. Listen, you become what you give your attention to. What you give your attention to is what you become. Friends, our goal as followers of Jesus is to become like Jesus. And if that's the case, we've got to give our attention and our affection to Jesus. So let me just ask you this. How much of your time and how much of your attention are you giving to God? How much of your time and how much of your attention are you giving to Jesus? You might say, you know what? I can totally hear you saying this. I'm really busy right now. I don't have time to give attention to God. And I just want to lovingly push back on that. I mentioned a minute ago that the average iPhone user touches their phone over 2,600 times a day. There's more research than that. The average social media user spends 706 hours every year on social media. For millennials, it's actually twice that. So it's 2.5 hours every day for the average social media user. For millennials and Gen Z, it's twice that. Let me just kind of put that into perspective. 706 hours. If you said that a regular working week is 40 hours, that's about 4.5 months of working hours every year spent on social media. It's worse when you look at TV and binge watching on Netflix. The average American spends over 2,700 hours a year watching TV. The average male, by the time, and I was included in this very much. This is not exclusive of me, right? The average male, by the time they turn 21, they've spent 10,000 hours playing video games. By the time they turn 21, you can do a lot of things with that time. Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book several years ago that kind of focused on what it takes to become an expert in any one field. And he said it takes about 10,000 hours devoted to something. In 10,000 hours, you can become a concert pianist, right? In 10,000 hours, you could memorize the entire New Testament. In 10,000 hours, you could get your undergraduate degree and your graduate degree. In 10,000 hours, with $10 an hour, you could make $100,000. Or with 10,000 hours, you can beat level 4 in Call of Duty. How much time and attention are you giving to God? You have time. You have time for what you choose to have time for. And so I want to challenge you this week with a practice. Last week we said, hey, let's just practice slowing down. This week, I want to challenge you to practice silence and solitude. Silence and solitude. There are a couple different ways that you can do that. You can do that in simple moments of silence and solitude, right? Maybe it's in your car. Maybe this week when you drive in your car, you turn it off. Don't listen to anything. And just spend your drive time listening for the voice of God. Maybe you take your kids to the park on a play date and you've got just a minute to sit on a bench. Maybe don't look at your phone and just sit there for a minute. and breathe and listen for the voice of God. Simple moments of silence and solitude. I also want to challenge you to some set moments of silence and solitude. Simple moments are just moments that happen throughout the day. Set moments of silence and solitude are moments that you choose intentionally. And I'd ask you to think about one of three things. One would be the most extreme. I did this in 2020, and it was life-changing. It's called a digital detox. A digital detox. And basically with a digital detox is you take your phone and you remove everything from your phone, except for maybe phone calls and texting. So in 2020, I removed Safari from my phone. I removed Facebook. I removed Twitter. I removed Instagram. I removed every app from my phone other than what would allow email. I took it off my phone. I removed everything other than what would allow me to make a phone call or send a text. And a digital detox is to do that for 30 straight days. And then after the end of 30 days, you only add back onto your phone the things that at that point you think add value to your life. A digital detox. You could try that. If you want to be a little less extreme than that, try a digital Sabbath this week. Turn your phone off and put it away for 24 hours. Just take a digital Sabbath. It's one of the best things you can do to turn your phone off. One of the best things you can do for your spiritual life. At the beginning of Lent this year, I decided to give up Facebook and internet news. I gave those up for Lent. I haven't picked them back up because I found that they weren't adding value to my life. Do you know what I've missed by not having Facebook and not being on Facebook over the last few months? Let me list the things that I've missed for you. Yeah, that's pretty much it. That's what I've missed. Or if you're not up for a digital detox or a digital Sabbath, just take a digital break. Set aside a couple hours, an hour or two during the day where you just turn it off and put it aside. Maybe it's when you're having dinner with your family. No phones for anybody. Maybe it's as you're getting ready for bed at night and you actually spend time talking to the people that are around you, the people who mean the most to you. Just take a digital break. You become like what you give your attention to, right? What you give your attention to is what you become. Let's see this week if we can become more like Jesus. I want to pray for you today. Let's pray. God, we thank you for who you are. We thank you that in the busyness and in the hecticness of life, Jesus modeled for us time away in a quiet place. We thank you that Jesus, even though he was the Messiah, the Son of God, he could walk on water, he could heal people from demons, he could make the blind see, he could make the mute speak again. Jesus, with all the power in the world, took time away to connect with you, God. And so this week, God, I pray that you would help us to simply be like Jesus, to be with him, to become like him, to do what he would do if he were us. God, help us to hear your voice. God, hear us now and help us to hear from you now as we simply take a moment of silence together. Help us to come to you this week and to find peace and rest for our souls. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.